The former CEO of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, Evan Sidall, has put himself on record this week claiming that the Canadian real estate market is not in a bubble. However, that isn't stopping him from pushing the 10% minimum down payment narrative that he had while he was in that position. We're going to discuss what all this means and whether or not the Canadian real estate market really is in a bubble in today's video. The definitive guide on how to manage your credit, product, penalty, price, in that order. It's never been more important to get your mortgage right. Okay, so welcome back. Today we're discussing Evan Sidall's comments on CTV, claiming that the Canadian real estate market isn't in a bubble. And I'm going to start first and foremost with a disclaimer. First and foremost, Evan Sidall is an incredibly intelligent human being. In order for him to run the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, he would need to be. He's got some considerable investment banking background out of New York City. He is one of the most qualified individuals when it comes to making predictions, and the word that comes to mind is accusations. That's not the right word, but perhaps assessments is the right word. In the country. He's simply put one of the most qualified individuals in the country to comment on this. And he has gone head to head with realtors, with mortgage brokers. And the main thing that I want to get across in my early disclaimer in this video is that I don't ever want to take on any individual. I believe that it comes without class. It is not right. It is not something that a perfect gentleman, as my grandfather used to say, would do. And I will never take on Evan Sidall as a human being. This video is purely about a conversation about the topic and the discussion and what we're discussing at hand, not him personally. So, I want to make that clear that anytime we do a video like this and we talk about an individual's comments, we're never coming from the place of trying to attack that individual. We're just going to discuss what is happening and the conversation that is being had. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to discuss whether or not the Canadian housing market is in a bubble and if we really should be increasing the down payment to a minimum of 10%. But before we get into it, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. And don't forget about our race to 25,000 subscribers, where one lucky winner will win $5,000 just for subscribing to this channel. But in order to win, you have to be subscribed. So go ahead, click that subscribe button. It's free, it's easy, and it's definitely worth it. And let's get into the conversation at hand. And Evan Sidall claiming and assessing that the Canadian real estate market is not in a bubble. So as we always do, I'm going to jump you into my screen here, show you the actual news article. CTV's news headline here: Canada not in midst of a housing bubble, says former housing and mortgage head. So this is an article. He went on CTV, had a pretty in-depth conversation. Both CTV is obviously covering this, BNN Bloomberg is covering this. And, the conversation was essentially this. First and foremost, he talks about whether or not the Canadian housing market is actually in a bubble. He assesses that it is not, and that is purely because of the supply and demand fundamentals, being that there is not a lot of supply and a ton of demand. And with interest rates changing and costs changing and so on and so forth, the actual fundamentals support a lot of the markets across Canada. Now, just to kind of take a look at this and kind of show you where Evan Sidall has been in the past on this conversation, if we scroll all the way down here and look to around June of this last year, you can see that he had some differing opinions with respect to whether or not the housing market was over leveraged and we were in a bubble. He went toe to toe with a bunch of mortgage brokers and realtors over the beginning of the year. And for example, if you take a look at his June 21st tweet, you can see he says, "Be careful not to confuse statutory requirements to offer mortgage insurance with inaction as to its impact. CMHC consistently warned about overheated markets and excessive borrowing. It has also unilaterally required stricter underwriting than its competition." So Evan Sidall, for the last couple of years, has always seemed to be a little bit bearish on the market. He's been a little bit bearish on Canadian housing. And he has, in many cases, talked about the housing market being overfueled. Now, in this case, he's talking about the housing market and it actually being in a bubble versus not being in a bubble. And I have to agree with his assessment mostly. I think most of the Canadian housing market is probably not in a bubble. If you go and you take a look at a pretty significant amount of the cities, according to the Oxford affordability study, quite a few of them are still quite affordable. For example, in Calgary, only 70% of the maximum amount people can purchase for is being used in order to purchase properties. And, if you go across the country, that number switches as you get into Vancouver and Toronto markets. So the question is, what is a bubble? And I went and I took the liberty of going and taking a look on Investopedia. I'm not saying Investopedia is the best source for definitions and so on and so forth, but if you go and you take a look at their definition of a bubble, you can see that a bubble is an economic cycle that is characterized by the rapid escalation of a market value, particularly in the price of assets. The fast inflation is followed by a quick decrease in value or a contraction that is sometimes referred to as a crash or a bubble burst. So let's talk about this for a second. Yes, have we had a rapid escalation of the market? Absolutely. Is it due to anything other than the fundamentals changing? Maybe part of it, maybe not. So for the most part, most of the rapid increase in housing prices has been twofold. It's been a change in people's preferences for housing, wanting to be further away from the city, further away from downtown cores, and lower interest rates, which has allowed people to purchase higher value properties. So the fundamentals from a qualifying standpoint really haven't changed except for those really overvalued markets. And I think we can say at this point that Toronto and Vancouver are overvalued because people are purchasing at significantly more than what they have capacity for, at least according to that Oxford study. So, I think if you take a look at some of the higher valued markets and some of the markets in and around Toronto, I think there's at least a conversation to be had about some of those markets actually being in bubble territory, where housing prices are going up substantially because people are just buying because they're trying to get their hands on real estate. If you look at other areas like, say, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, eastern provinces, Montreal, Quebec, yes, has there been run-ups in prices? But absolutely, but a lot of them are largely due to the fact that the fundamentals have changed. So that takes us to kind of the next part of this conversation. Are we in a bubble? Are we not in a bubble? I think some markets may be close to that bubble territory where we risk them deflating if something changes in those markets, but other markets are still in pretty stable territory. The question is, what should be done? Now, Evan Sidall in his article here, or in his conversation, suggests, much like RBC suggested back at the beginning of the year, that a suitable plan might be to have a debate around removing the capital gains tax exemption on houses, or at least putting a ceiling on it, maybe putting a $200,000-$300,000 ceiling on the capital gains that are exempted from being taxed. Now, this would be a pretty hard conversation to be had because obviously, any politician that brings this up is going to get slaughtered by pretty much any other party in Canada. The person who suggests it, the person who tries to follow through on it is committing political suicide. So it's a really, really hard conversation to be had at a parliamentary level. Furthermore, if you take a look at the US goes one step further and allows people to actually write off their mortgage payments on their taxes. And these are both practices that are designed to encourage home ownership because, much like CMHC's mandate was to allow and encourage home ownership for pretty much everybody, well, Canadian and North American culture indicates that we should be allowing people to purchase properties, own properties, and have that be a form of increasing wealth. That's why Warren Buffett has said that buying a home is the single best investment a person can make. So, having that conversation around capital gains becomes one that's pretty difficult. Now, the next question becomes, okay, well, if we aren't going to have the capital gains exemption and eliminating that conversation, well, then what is the next step? And the next step, and what Evan Sidall continues to suggest, if you go and you take a look at the BNN Bloomberg article, is at the very bottom here, he suggests, what I would do is I would look at the construct of mortgage insurance. So I would increase the minimum down payment from 5 to 10% for sure. I might even bracket it. In other words, he might even increase it just across the board from 5 to 20% down payment to 10 to 25% down payment to cover more of the waterfront. He's basically saying that he would require more equity. He goes on to say, I actually think that would be a smart move. Now, here's the problem with this. I don't think it would be a smart move because increasing the amount of down payment required to purchase a house would have a disproportionately negative effect on people who are less wealthy or have less means or have less family members that are able to support them in their down payment requirement. So what this does is that in the same way that he's arguing that having a capital gains tax exemption marginalizes people and creates a further divide in wealth, well, causing more down payment to be required would have the same marginalizing effect on those people who are less able to afford to purchase a house. So what it would do is it would take the poor who are this far away from home ownership and it would move them even further away from home ownership, which I think fundamentally is just wrong. Now, liberal, NDP, conservative, completely right-wing, completely left wing, I think you have to agree that if you make that down payment barrier bigger, you're going to have the biggest disproportionate effect on poor people. And that sucks. So I think that is fundamentally wrong. And again, not attacking Evan Sidall here, but what I am doing is I am attacking the idea where I don't believe that you should necessarily require a bigger down payment for anybody. Especially when you would be marginalizing the people who are at the lower end of the income bracket. So I think that, across the board, the conversation that we're having here is, first of all, is the Canadian housing market in a bubble? I think most of it is not. There's some markets that are bubble-like, especially in and around that Toronto area and the Vancouver area. And I think there could be some pain to be had there in the future. I definitely wouldn't be investing in those areas. That's just me, though. That's my opinion. The second thing we're talking about is capital gains taxes. Should those go away? I think you can't do that just because it would be political suicide for whoever suggested it. So I think it's a non-starter from a conversation standpoint. Would it have an effect on the economy and housing? Absolutely. But why even have those conversations if we wouldn't even be able to get across the starting line? And then last but not least, should we be increasing the minimum down payments? Absolutely not. Again, it would disproportionately affect the marginalized people in society already. And that, in my mind, is just an awful idea, no matter what your political stripes are. So across the board, I think Evan Sidall is an incredibly intelligent human being. I think the Canadian housing market as a whole is definitely not in a bubble. There are portions of it that do risk becoming part of a bubble or risk being in a bubble. And, at the end of the day, I think it's an interesting conversation. I think it's kind of interesting that he's coming out of the woodwork 5 months after he is no longer in that CEO position. And absolutely, I encourage him to continue to have these conversations and be a voice in the Canadian real estate market because, quite frankly, he is one of the best equipped human beings on the planet in order to comment on that Canadian real estate market. So I'm glad he's here. I'm glad he's talking. I'm glad he's having conversations. I'm glad that he's not in a position where he can effectively lobby the government to increase minimum down payments to 10%. But I'm glad that he's here to continue to have that conversation around housing. And ultimately, I think we can all agree on one thing, and that is that supply is the thing that is the biggest problem right now. And we need to get rid of those barriers, both from a municipality standpoint, from a provincial standpoint, and from a federal standpoint, in order to get more houses built and more housing supply made available. So if you are in the process of getting a home or buying a home or thinking about buying a home, we have all sorts of resources. They're all linked in the description below. We have our down payment challenge that will start again in the next couple of weeks. We have our home buyer boot camp, which is one of the best sources of information to be well equipped to purchase a home in Canada and make sure that you don't get screwed along the way. We talk about everything from how to select a realtor to how to select a mortgage broker to all the steps in the process of actually purchasing a home. And last but not least, if you found this video useful, do me that favor, click that subscribe button, click that notification bell. Please click that like button so more people like you can see this video, and we'll see you on the very next one. Cheers.